Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to The Truth. I'm your host, the one who loved the most, Niall Heston, back with a brand new episode here on The Truth. Back once again with my boy AJ Ponciano. AJ, how are you doing here today?
I'm doing great. How about yourself now?
I'm doing great as well. We have now transitioned over to week nine, or we've been transitioned over to week nine after the Thursday night game. And today we're going to focus on Sunday and Monday night football here in the NFL. We're going to give you guys our three starts, three sits, three sleepers, and three busts to help prepare your fantasy team for the upcoming week. We're not necessarily to crunch time as far as playoffs are concerned, but for teams that are kind of sitting 4-4, 3-5, maybe 2-6, these are an opportunity for you to kind of get back on track and really kind of progress to hopefully make that postseason run, because depending on your league settings, not everybody makes the postseason. So these are some important weeks coming up here. Even though we haven't started playoffs, you want to get to playoffs, and hopefully we can help you achieve that goal here today. Anyways, AJ, go ahead and give me your three starts this week.
So my first one, I'm gonna go with the new Chief in DeAndre Hopkins. And Mahomes has needed a target up to this point, since losing Rasheed Rice, and obviously Travis Kelce's done a great job at that. But Hopkins, I think, could really help out this week, especially going against the Bucks, who I believe will lose the time possession, going against a really good Chiefs defense. Still without Mike Evans this week. Obviously, Godwin out for the whole year. But also the Bucks have given up the third most passing yards up to this point, just under 2,200, like 15 pass touchdowns to only 5 interceptions. I think Mahomes, I wouldn't say a breakout game because obviously we know who Mahomes is, but maybe a breakout game since week one for this season. I mean, this could potentially be the move that turns around Patrick Mahomes as a viable fantasy option. Now he has another wide receiver that can stretch the field a little bit more, and is more of that bigger body wide receiver that he hasn't really had much in his career up to this point. Next up, I'm going to another wide receiver, Chris Olave. It looks like Derek Carr will be back this week, which is huge for Olave because since Rattler has taken over, it just really hasn't been that good for them to be able to move the ball offensively, especially for Olave. Him missing those first 2 weeks with Rattler because of concussion very early on. But with that, the Saints are going against the Panthers, and the Panthers suck. They've given up, I want to say it's the eighth most passing yards, just over 1,900. But they have allowed 17 passing touchdowns and only to 3 interceptions. A rivalry game here, so even though the Saints and Panthers are both at the very bottom of the division right now, it's more of a pride game at this point. Anytime you play a divisional opponent like that, especially when you're going to probably end up being one of the bottom two teams, you just don't want to beat that bottom team in your division. It's kind of more of a pride play, especially with Derek Carr coming back. The Saints usually don't lose to the Panthers. I think the last time that they truly got blown out by the Panthers was when Cam Newton was there back in 2015 or 2016, wherever which one was that MVP year that they had. So I expect Olave to have a good game. And then Michael Pittman Jr. Michael Pittman Jr. has just had to deal with Anthony Richardson at quarterback all year. And now Joe Flacco, who has been named the starter, he's done well with Flacco. That was one of the things that Flacco uses his wide receivers a little bit different, especially more in the middle of the field, more of those 15, 20-yard plays in comparison to Anthony Richardson, where he wasn't able to hit any of those type of routes. He was only a really go ball specialist. It was him rushing the ball, maybe like a 5-yard slant, or it was a 60-yard, 70-yard touchdown. I mean, that's all he was able to do. And Flacco brings a different dimension, especially with Pittman, because Pittman's not that type of receiver where he's really going to stretch the field like a Alec Pierce, a Donnie Mitchell, or a Josh Downs. He's more of that guy who will get you 10, 15 yards on an underneath route, just kind of be one of those guys in the middle of the field. And going against the Vikings, who've been solid defensively as a whole this year, has given up the sixth most passing yards, just over 2,000. They have allowed 14 touchdowns, but also 12 interceptions. So I'm assuming this game, the script's going to be very pass heavy for the Colts, probably being down early on, probably having their struggles also with switching back to Joe Flacco again this year. Not as big of struggles early on, but again, I think they would be down a lot, and I think this could be a game where Pittman gets over 100 yards here with 8-9 receptions.
So for my first start, I'll stick with that same game. I'm going to go with Joe Flacco. So obviously the news broke that Anthony Richardson was going to be benched for Joe Flacco. Joe Flacco has already played in 3 games with Anthony Richardson out with injury, and honestly he's performed better than Anthony Richardson has in the 4 or 5 games that he's played. On the season for Flacco has 716 yards for 7 touchdowns and 1 interception, has 6 carries for 26 yards, so he can move a little bit. His best game was obviously week 5 against Jacksonville, 33 for 44, 353, 3-0 touchdown interception ratio, and 3 carries for 22 yards. I think the biggest thing and the biggest reason why I'm starting Joe Flacco is the fact that he's going to be emerging as the QB1 for this week. Obviously, as you mentioned, the Vikings defense did show some, I wouldn't say insecurities, but did show some struggles last week against the Rams in that passing attack. That was definitely concerning as a Vikings fan myself. I thought that the Vikings pass defense game was actually a strength of theirs. Obviously, early on with Brian Flores sending the blitzes, Ginkle 2 interception touchdowns. Like, I just thought that the Vikings defense was going to show out a little bit better. I understand having 2 premier wide receivers like Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua is going to change that. But anyways, I think that favors the Colts offense and the wide receivers and quarterback play. Obviously, Michael Pittman, as you mentioned, maybe guys like Josh Downs really start to get going. A.D. Mitchell, like guys that kind of held back from Anthony Richardson's passing attack, maybe will be able to step up to the plate nicely and have success. On top of that, there's always this thing like when a quarterback gets benched, the next game or like the first game that the new quarterback is playing, they usually always do good. Think of like Deshaun Watson, Jameis Winston, especially they're a veteran quarterback. Jameis Winston comes in last week, has a tremendous week. Think of Andy Dalton for Bryce Young, which, by the way, Bryce Young, Anthony Richardson in that same draft class had a tremendous start in the first game back. Now, I know it's not Flacco's first game back, but maybe there'd be a little bit more juice, particularly with the wide receivers, that help impacts his play. On top of that, it's a Sunday night game. You know, a lot of people are going to be watching that game. A lot of people are going to be watching that game to obviously see what Flacco's going to do and if this Colts offense can change moving forward. Secondly, I'm going to go with Dak. It's been hard to root for Dak. I mean, obviously, as I mentioned with takeaways last 2 shows ago, I should say, Dak really has kind of been like a garbage time quarterback, it seems like, throughout the season, especially last week when he had those 243 yards for 2 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. It's just not the Dak Prescott that we know, and you never really know what you're going to get out of Dak. He's had weeks like Baltimore where he had 379 yards for 2 touchdowns, 29.8 fantasy points. And he's had weeks like Detroit where he has 178 yards, 0 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. Has zero rushing value whatsoever. I think he had somewhat rushing value before his devastating injury a couple of years ago, and really has just kind of not evolved into that rushing quarterback that I wouldn't say he was expecting to be, but people were maybe hoping that he'd be, especially at this point of his career. But anyways, he's going to be strictly through the air. It's kind of hard to see just because they got guys like CeeDee Lamb, Ferguson. I know CeeDee Lamb had that breakout game last week that kind of reinnovated his game and Dak's game as a whole. But I think this is a favorable matchup, honestly, for Dak Prescott going into Atlanta, which Atlanta at times obviously is playing from behind. Their defense is all right. I don't think it's anything too special, but I really think this could be a good bounce back game for Dak. Has had 2 rough weeks, including that bye week in the middle there to kind of split up 3 weeks total. I think this could be an opportunity for him to get on the road. On top of that, the Cowboys need to start winning some ball games, and I think that Dak Prescott could definitely be a contributor for that. And finally, I'm going to go with Cade Otton. I think there was a lot of hype surrounding Cade Otton after week 7. So last week in week 8 with Atlanta, he was targeted from the jump. I think in the first half, at least maybe in the first 3 quarters, he had 7 for like 70 and a touchdown. Ended up finishing the game with 9 for 81 and 2 touchdowns to equate to 29.1 fantasy points, which is obviously great there. And then the week before that against Baltimore, 8 catches for 100 yards. Obviously, that was the game as well where Evans and Godwin did get injured. So kind of a sticky situation, but it's kind of been like a next man up mentality for Cade Otton. He's kind of emerged himself as a wide receiver 1 per se, while Mike Evans is obviously out, I believe, for 2 more weeks, including this one. And then obviously Chris Godwin's out for the year. So Godwin stepped up nicely to the plate. I think Baker Mayfield's going to continue to trust reliable veteran guys like Cade Otton, as well as maybe guys out of the backfield like Rashad White and Bucky Irving. Maybe Jalen McMillan and Trey Palmer get going, but they really didn't last week. And last week was a perfect opportunity for that. On top of that, they're playing Monday Night Football in Kansas City. Kansas City's pass defense, I feel like, is relatively solid as well, but I feel like Baker can definitely manipulate that. He's played against that defense before and has had good success with it in recent memory. So I think Cade Otton's a for sure must start. And on top of that, he's only rostered in 71.6% of leagues. So a guy that's a position ranked 6 tight end with 2 of the top weapons out for the Buccaneers, this is a guy you absolutely should be campaigning to get as soon as possible. All right, what about your sits?
First one's going to be Marvin Harrison Jr. going against the Bears. Jalen Johnson should be on him for most of the game, and his Bears defense has been really good against the pass. Just giving up over 1,500 yards, which is the 7th best in the NFL. Only 5 touchdowns with 7 interceptions. here. I get it. There's a good chance the Cardinals are playing from behind. They're going to have to pass a lot. But Marvin Harrison Jr. has been very streaky. He's had 2 games over 100 yards at this point. I believe his first game was back in week 2. Maybe it was week 3. And then just last week. It was one of those things that they've been using him very weirdly. They've been using him as this like true stretch down the field wide receiver, which he does have the capability of doing. But if you look at his Ohio State film, like he was in the middle of the field a lot of the time. They're just kind of getting the ball out in space, giving it up so he can go make plays for himself. And they really haven't been able to do that with him. There was just a lot of like 10-yard digs, some comebackers, like 12, 15 yards. And then outside of that, like I said, just a lot of go routes. It's been kind of weird the way they've been playing him this year, and I just don't really expect that to change, especially against one of these top defenses like the Bears, who also, one of the big things, has shut down the touchdown game. Like I said, only 5 touchdowns through the air. They've given up to 7 interceptions. I mean, amazing ratios right there for for that Bears defense. Next up, I'm going to go with Travis Etienne Jr. I get it, he's coming back from injury, so you may have some question marks on starting him. I'd say not. I mean, Derrius Johnson was doing just fine. Tank Bigsby has been doing fine. But one of the big things is the defense that they're going against. The Eagles' run defense has been great. It was great last year. I believe they finished second last year. This year they're at 6 right now for allowing 749 yards and only 4 rushing touchdowns. He's coming off injury. He looks like he feels good. They should be ready to go to play week 9. But again, coming off kind of an injury, I just don't really trust it. The other running backs have been playing much better than him. He's been splitting time already at this point. He was supposed to be the main ball handler of that backfield, but like I said, they've been with him and Bixby. They were splitting time, and even the other running backs they've been using the last couple of weeks, they've been pretty productive. And lastly, I'm going to go for Ramondre Stevenson. Ramondre Stevenson just really hasn't been used like he was early on, especially with Drake May in. I think Drake May is out this week with a concussion. I could be wrong with that, so they're going to go back to Brissett. But they're going against the Titans defense, which is kind of surprisingly been good on like all facets of the both passing and receiving. They're right now at number 10 for least amount of rushing yards given up at 793. They have allowed 7 rushing touchdowns, but Stevenson really just doesn't give you that receiving option, and he's kind of lost that role to be able to be that feature back there. They kind of have a little more rotation right now. He hasn't really been that true workhorse like we saw in the first couple weeks, where he was getting you 100 yards pretty consistently or 80 plus yards pretty consistently, and looking like that he's going to be a 1,000-yard rusher with like 10 plus touchdowns on the ground. You just haven't really seen that, and this defense has been pretty good. I don't expect them to be. I think this game could be a back and forth one, but just not a lot of yards. I think there's going to be a lot of maybe 6, 7 play drives and that end up in punts. I mean, we'll have 4 and outs. Both defenses have been solid, and both offenses at this point are playing with backup quarterbacks, with Rudolph over there for the Titans and Brissett, who was the starter, I believe, is starting this week for the Patriots.
So my first is going to be another quarterback. I feel like I'm going to be kind of talking a lot about quarterbacks just because this is a crucial time here in fantasy. The first that I'm going to go with is Jameis Winston. I love the guy, obviously. How can you not love famous Jameis? 30-30 season. I mean, one of the guys that up and down collectively a lot of people root for. Had a really great week last week for the Browns in that win and that upset. 334 yards for 3 touchdowns, 0 interceptions on the day, 23.5 fantasy points. You got to be pleased overall. I mean, that was the expectation. Now, obviously, Deshaun Watson got injured, which is why Jameis Winston stepped up as the QB1. But the expectation was Jameis Winston could kind of hold his own and maybe kind of lead the Browns back, even though I believe they're 2-6 or 1-5, 2-5, something like that. Not very good record overall. So kind of fighting for a low pick, which could be potentially what they go for. Maybe they shop for a quarterback in the draft. Regardless, for this season, obviously Jameis, it seems to be the quarterback at least throughout the rest of the season. DTR got his opportunity in that game that Watson went down, I believe, at like 84 yards and 2 interceptions. So not a very good look for him. But anyways, I think it's going to be a little bit of a hangover effect. On top of that, the Chargers have a really good defense overall. The Chargers are a very good defensive sounded team when they run the football effectively, and I think they're going to be able to do that on that Browns defense. I know the Browns obviously got some big forcers there. Myles Garrett is one of them. They have some other guys as well that could really stop the run, but I think the Chargers are kind of flowing in their defense as well. They're flowing in their offense as well, and they're just going to take the ball out of Jameis Winston's hands. And on top of that, one or two interceptions could completely transform this game, and I just feel like Jameis Winston, a guy, especially with zero rushing value, he's a guy that would probably get less than 14, 13 fantasy points, and a guy that a lot of people are kind of excited about seeing what he did last week, but realizing that there's kind of a hangover effect. Just kind of look at Andy Dalton, what happened there when he had his good week and started to fall down, and I think that's going to continue with Jameis. Secondly, I'm going to go with Tua. Look, Tua obviously first game back from his concussion last week, 14.6 fantasy points. I thought overall played fine, especially in his first game in four games. 73% completion percentage for 234 yards, one touchdown, zero interceptions, had 3 carries for 13 yards. Didn't have the explosive game that I was maybe expecting, particularly with guys like Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, but at least was making strides in the right direction. And I think he is continuing to do that. The only issue is the fact that they're going into Buffalo, and Buffalo is a very difficult place to play, particularly at this time of the year and as we progress later into the season. This is a divisional rival here. This is a Buffalo team that does want to obviously bump the brakes out of Miami. I think they're going to have a good potential to do so. But looking at a guy like Tua, you obviously got to find some discrepancies. You got to look at Tua's concussion history and realize kind of what his production component is really going to look like. I think Tua is on the right path. Obviously, he's got to get a little bit more familiar back into the league after missing the last 4 games. The biggest thing that concerns me with Tua is the fact that they're going into Buffalo. I think he played fine for that first game back, and there's going to be one of these games coming up here where he really struggles. But most importantly, guys like Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle should be moving in the right path forward. And then my final set's going to be Caleb Williams. I mean, again, I feel like I've been really hit or miss on Caleb Williams, but before last game and before that bye week, he had 3 weeks of progressively getting better. Last week had 9.34 fantasy points. Really didn't do too much. Went 10 for 24 for 131. Had 10 carries for 41 yards as well. The completion percentage is what really worries me. The lowest completion percentage of the year. I understand the Commanders' defense is a good defense and a defense that you don't really want to mess around with, but I think Caleb Williams could have done a better job, especially that completion percentage of 10 for 24. There was a lot of open receivers I was watching that game that he kind of overthrew, missed through, kind of felt a little hurried in the pocket. He's going into another difficult situation in Arizona, which is a sleeper team that I feel like not too many people are respecting at the moment. But he was trending in the right direction forward. I think he has an opportunity to do so as the season wears on. But that's going to be more next week when they kick off that 3-game homestand with New England, Green Bay, and Minnesota. All right, what about any sleepers?
First one, running back Brian Robinson Jr. I feel like people still aren't really respecting him right now, especially in fantasy, because he isn't that big name, and I think a lot of people are also scared of Jane Daniels taking away those rushing touchdowns and rushing yards with his running ability. But he's been great all year, and he's going against one of the worst rush defenses in the league, and the Giants, who have given him the 5th most rushing yards at 1,134 and 6 rushing touchdowns. I think this is going to be a big game. I think they're going to be up early. It's going to be one of those games. Jane Daniels will be neighbors, LSU boys reuniting, playing against each other there. I think Jane Daniels has a solid game, but I think this is a game where Robinson could get 75 yards. I don't think he gets as many yards, but I think he gets 2 touchdowns once they get down to the red zone, especially with them missing some of those defensive linemen. Kayvon Thibodeau, I believe, is still going to be out. They do have Dexter Lawrence still and Brian Burns, which are great in their defense, but Kayvon Thibodeau is one of those big run stoppers there that they're going to be missing. Next up, I'm going to go with Troy Franklin. Troy Franklin going against the Ravens this week. Ravens really haven't been that good defensively, at least through the air. Granted, it could be because they've been in a lot of shootouts and just kind of ended up them having a lot more yards. But they're leading the league and yards given up through the air at almost 2,500, which is almost 250 more than the Jaguars, which I've been on the Jaguars all season about how bad their pass defense is. Ravens are right there with them. 17 touchdowns to 5 interceptions. Not a great ratio there. I don't think Bo Nix is going to have a huge game here, but this could be a game where I see Bo Nix just going to Trey Franklin, going to his reliable target there. He's been going to Sutton a little bit more this season, but I could see Franklin in a deeper league, picking him up, getting him 4 receptions for like 45 yards and maybe a touchdown towards the end of the game. I wouldn't be too surprised if he does something along those lines. And lastly, Jalen Tolbert. How you talked about Dak Prescott, it's been hard to start him in fantasy. Tolbert's been one of those back and forth guys. He had a big game against the Steelers, and then I feel like he kind of disappeared a little bit. But going against the Falcons defense, who has been solid, they've given up almost 1,800 yards at this point, middle of the pack right now in the NFL, but 13 touchdowns, 7 interceptions. This is a game that I could definitely see the Cowboys playing behind by a touchdown almost the entire game. And they're going to be doubling CD at this point. I mean, obviously CD is the main option. They can just basically count out the run game because it's been non-existent for the Cowboys up to this point. And I think that leaves Tolbert to be able to play really well out of the slot. From what I remember watching some of the other games with the Bucks and Chris Godwin had a really good game against the Falcons, and Godwin played a lot out of the slot. I think that's what Tolbert's role is going to be. I know CD bounces inside to outside from the slot and playing outside. But I think Tolbert's role could be a lot bigger this week. Again, 5 to 7 receptions wouldn't be too surprising, especially if they're playing from behind, doubling CD. Maybe like 60, 70 yards, about 10 yards of reception roughly. But you'll take that. That's a flex option, especially with bye weeks and all that, needing to fill in. So when Tolbert's probably a high end wide or middle pack wide receiver too, more of a flex play.
So my first sleeper is going to be Isaiah Likely. I feel like the roles have kind of flipped. Obviously, Likely started the season up here, Andrews right here. Then they kind of met at a crossroads, and now I feel like recently it's been Andrews up here and Likely down here. I feel like that's going to continue to be kind of a back and forth thing throughout the season. Obviously, Likely had that touchdown in week 1, had 2 touchdowns in week 5 on 3 receptions for 13 yards, and has really kind of limited his production overall throughout the rest of the season. But I think this is a perfect opportunity for Likely to get back in the swing of things. Denver does usually give up. I was looking at the stats. Like, I think it's like 5 teams in the NFL give up more receiving touchdowns than Denver from the tight end position. So regardless if it's Mark Andrews getting one or Isaiah Likely getting one, Isaiah Likely is still a reliable option. On top of that, talk about, or actually, I would say if you can find me another team that has Mark Andrews or one tight end roster at 85% and the other tight end and Isaiah Likely roster at 43%, tell me if you can find another team that's like that. It's just really not the case besides in Baltimore. Lamar likes throwing to guys like Likely. Honestly, some games he'll throw to Zay Flowers, then he won't. The next week he'll throw to Isaiah Likely, then he won't. Then he'll throw to Andrews, then he won't. You really don't know with the Ravens, but I think Isaiah Likely could definitely be a sleeper option, especially since they're returning home here against Denver. I think that could be a perfect opportunity for him to get on the board and early, especially since he's rostered in 40% of leagues. Secondly, I'm going to go with Nick Chubb. Nick Chubb kind of intensified his workload last week from 11 carries and 22 yards with a score to 16 carries for 52 yards. 5.2 fantasy points, not overall ecstatic about it, but you are excited about the 16 carries for 52 yards. Always with these guys come back from injury, it takes about 2 games for them to really get their feet wet and back in the swing of things for that 3rd and 4th game where they really pop off. And I think that's a perfect opportunity for them to do so. Yeah, the Chargers got a very scary front, but I think they're going to try to really force feed the ball to Nick Chubb as a whole, just because Nick Chubb is a elite running back, and he's now kind of getting familiated back to playing in the league. On top of that, who knows with Jameis Winston? You're going to get a 5-touchdown performance with 0 interceptions or a 0-touchdown performance with 5 interceptions. You just don't know, and I think they're going to do a really good job of getting him involved. I think they also try to get him involved a little bit more in the passing game, especially because of that Chargers front. Regardless, I think Nick Chubb's an easy sleeper with 15, 16 plus fantasy points, especially going into that matchup against LA. And finally, I'm going to go with Matthew Stafford. Was a little bit surprised that he didn't get rostered in more than 6.9% of leagues last week, currently sitting at 26.5 rostered leagues. By far his best week of the season last week, of course, against my Minnesota Vikings, a 73% completion percentage for 279 yards, 4 touchdowns, and 1 interception for 24.7 fantasy points. Obviously, 0 rushing value, but the biggest thing is why he struggled throughout the year is he hasn't had his weapons. He got Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp back, and both of them were not really on the field the entirety of the game as well, and that's what Matthew Stafford was able to do. It's crucial when quarterbacks have their weapons. Think of Brock Purdy when he doesn't have his weapons, or think of any quarterback in the NFL. Sam Darnold had no weapons. Now he's got weapons, and he looks a lot better. Like, it's just one of those things that in the NFL you need to have weapons, and Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp are 2 of the best weapons in all of football, and Matthew Stafford's got that repertoire to use now. So I definitely think he's a guy, as long as they stay healthy, that you could consistently roster and consistently start. He's the guy that's going to get you at least 17, 18 points every week, which isn't super flashy, but I'd rather have a guy that I know is going to give me 18 points a week as opposed to a guy that's going to either give you 26 points a week or 9 points a week. On top of that, Seattle's pass defense is terrible. They're really really going to be able to kind of manipulate that through the air, and that's going to really help lead them to success. But again, I was a little bit surprised that he wasn't maybe picked up in a couple more leagues. Okay, and then finally, what about Bus?
I'm going to go with the entire Buccaneers running back room, and it's mainly because I think they're playing behind, and they're playing one of the best run defenses in the NFL this season against the Chiefs, allowing the second least amount of rushing yards at 576, and only 4 rushing touchdowns. Now I get it, Rashad White and Bucky Irving, and even Sean Tucker, they all kind of bring some receiving value to the table, but and I could see this being one of those Baker Mayfield games that we've seen the last couple weeks or last week without Chris Godwin, 330 yards, like 2 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. Just not really able to get the run game going because of how good that run defense is. Now I think that they could all have solid games, and just because there's 3 running backs that they love using, switching out. I remember Bucky started one drive, went like 3 plays. Rashad White came in for another 3 plays. Sean Tucker was in there for another 2 plays, and then Bucky was right back in. I mean, just there's no true workhorse there. As much as I love Bucky Irving and I love Rashad White's receiving value that he brings to the table, having that third running back there and Sean Tucker that they started bringing in because of his big game against the Saints a few weeks back kind of just diminishes a little bit that value because the snap count going down, the opportunities going down. And again, going against one of the top run defenses in the Chiefs, I don't expect them to be able to really get it going. Again, PPR value is a little bit there, but especially if you're in a non-PPR league, I would highly suggest looking at sitting them if they're in your flex position. Next up, I'm going to go with Josh Jacobs going against the Lions. Lions' 4th best run defense in the NFL right now, 713 yards. They have allowed 7 rushing touchdowns, which is the most within like the top 10 for rushing touchdowns given up. But interdivisional game out in the cold, I get it that they're at home. The Packers, they should be used to it. But Josh Jacobs, I don't think he's really that used to it. He's been playing in the dome most of his career. He hasn't really had to deal with the weather. I guess in Oakland, not playing in the dome, but it's not as snowy. It's not how it is like it is in Green Bay. I think it's going to be very slow. I think both offenses, I'm not going to say move slow, but I think it's going to be a little bit of a high or closer scoring game, a little bit more low scoring game here, probably like a 23-20 type game. Again, interdivisional game, working for one of those top spots in the division. It's always going to be tough between those two, between the Lions and Packers. It seems like it is every single year. And then James Cook's going to be my last win, going against the Dolphins. I get it. James Cook has been good, but he's dealing with turf toe, which if you guys don't know what that is, that's the injury Michael Thomas had to his foot when he got injured. And good, Cook has been dealing with it. He's played last week. He played the week before that with it. But turf toe is not one of those injuries you can like go get surgery on and be good in like 3 weeks. It's like a ligament. It's a muscle underneath like your big toe that is essentially like a ligament at the same time. Like you can't really do a whole lot to it, and surgery kind of just takes you out for the entire year. So it's a weird one. And the Miami's run defense has been solid. One of the big things is they have allowed 10 rushing touchdowns, but 866 yards there, solid. They're in the top 15. They've been all right this year, but I think this is going to be a big Josh Allen game. I mean, we saw it. Cook had a really good game against the Dolphins earlier this year. I think they really hone in on James Cook on defense, and this could be a Josh Allen like 2 passing, 2 rushing touchdown type of game. I wouldn't be too surprised if they just try to hone in to try to stop James Cook after he had 3 touchdowns early this year against them.
So my first bust is going to be Gardner Minshew. Obviously, Gardner Minshew has not had a good season. I think the Raiders were expecting a little bit more from Gardner Minshew after what he did there in Indianapolis. But last week, in his first game with Aiden O'Connell on IR, he went 24 for 30 for 209 and 2 touchdowns. That's a lot better than before when he went 15 for 34 for 154 and 3 interceptions. I definitely think going into this matchup with Cincinnati's had a little bit better of a defense I think people are giving them credit for. I think Gardner Minshew is going to be able to have a little bit of a difficult task going up against that defense. That's the biggest thing there. Top that the Raiders' offense really hasn't been flowing. He doesn't have really insane targets to throw to besides Brock Bowers. With Devontae Adams now officially gone. Secondly, I'm going to go with Kayshon Boutte, something like that. Patriots wide receiver, probably somebody that not too many people know too much about. He's only rostered in 0.3% of leagues. The only reason why I mentioned him as a bust is I think people are starting to I was reading an article the other day about people kind of starting to get up some hype with some other rookies not performing as well. Bout's a guy that people were kind of thinking, oh, this guy would be a deep sleeper. Well, he had 3 catches for 46 yards last week for 7.6 points. The week before that, 1 for 33. And the week before that, 3 for 59 and a touchdown. Very fluky. It's hard to tell with a rookie quarterback in Drake May. Obviously, I don't think Drake May is playing. Even with Jacoby Brissett, he had no really real receptions. 1-1-2. That's really all that he got. So it's one of those things that I think you need to pump the brakes on him a little bit, especially into this matchup going into Tennessee, which obviously two really bad teams in the AFC, but Tennessee trying to salvage somewhat of a season and kind of to help plan for their future moving forward. And then finally, I'm going to go with Daniel Jones. I feel like 1 week I'm starting Daniel Jones, 1 week I'm sitting Daniel Jones. He's been on a decline since that big game in week 5 at Seattle where he had 22 fantasy points, 11.8, 5.9, and 6.6 last week at Pittsburgh. Had that big lost fumble. On top of that, last week had 3 carries for 1 yard. As Daniel Jones's value really kind of magnified was because of his rushing ability. And he's not showcasing that at all. That's something that's very concerning. Going into this matchup against Washington, we saw what Washington was able to do to a guy like Caleb Williams. They have a really good defense, and they have a really good offense, which is why they're a really good team. So I would probably avoid Daniel Jones as much as possible as well. Thank you guys for listening to another episode here on The Truth. If you guys did enjoy it, make sure you follow The Truth on Twitter, The Truth as one to stay up to date with the latest information regarding The Truth, including podcast dates, podcast uploads, and other important information you don't want to miss. Make sure you guys also follow The Truth on Instagram and TikTok at the.tt.truth. You're looking to find a drink that offers peak hydration, raises your energy level, speeds up your recovery, keeps your mind sharp to focus and memory. Look no further than Acid Rainwater. Excited partner with Planet Sports, AZ and Acid Rainwater focuses on peak hydration and productivity while also maintaining an ecosystem-friendly product. Use code HESSON15, that's HESSON15, for 50% off every purchase. As always, I'm your host, the one you love the most, Niall Hesson, joined once again by AJ Ponciano. Take care and good night.